This is the Level Up Engineering Podcast, where we talk with some of the most successful engineering leaders who reveal actionable management insights that help you take your developer team to the next level. This episode is brought to you by Coding Sans, a software development agency building web applications from design to delivery with React, Node.js, and Angular. Check them out at codingsans.com.
Welcome, everyone. This is the Level Up Engineering Podcast, and I am your host, Karolina Tóth. Today, I have a very special guest here with me, Michael Lopp. Welcome, Lopp.
Hello. Good to see you again.
Good to have you again. As a matter of fact, we recorded almost exactly 1 year ago.
That's right.
So maybe we can make this a thing now, and we will have a date every year.
Let's do next one in person. I'm getting tired of being in these little boxes on video. So next time we do it somewhere face to face, hopefully.
How much fun would that be?
That would be great.
All right. I will take a note, and now the rest of the world knows. So today I have you here for the second time, and whoever follows us knows that you've been here before, and you talked about leadership, its challenges, what you have learned in your quite exciting career. I don't know that you need a lot of introduction. You've been to a bunch of companies that are extremely successful. You've written a few books that are also very insightful. And now we have a special spin-off of the Level Up Engineering Podcast beginning with you. So thank you for being the first one here. And
absolutely.
This is called Level Up Engineering Stories. We will be talking about one of your success stories, which is called Slack. You were a VP of engineering at Slack.
Yes.
And this was a couple years ago, and you were there for a few years. And we would like to see and pick your mind about all the things that we can learn about running successful engineering teams in a product company. But before we start, just please say a few words about you. And for those of us who are not familiar with your black and white background, please tell us a bit more about your picture here.
Yeah. So the story is pretty boring, but it worked out really well. You'll see I'm in sort of this cool black and white sort of Ansel Adams kind of vibe. I've been doing this for, I don't know if I did it for the first interview with you. I was probably in color then. I don't know, maybe. Anyway, I went to black and white doing Peloton. So I was doing like spin class at home because that's what you do now during a pandemic. And I sat down after a meeting and in front of this camera and I was super red because I was flushed from exercise and I looked really awful. And I was like, oh my God. So I'm like, I had pretty fancy setup here. It's a nice SLR and I got some other stuff here. And I was like, what can I do about this blotchy red skin? So I'm like, oh, I'll just turn off the color. And I'm like, oh, that looks really good. So I just stuck with it. I was thinking, people ask this a lot, and I think I realized what I like about it is I kind of like dressing up when you go to work, but we haven't gone to work in like a year and a half, right? So this is sort of my way to dress up because I always, in meetings when I'm meeting new people, I like people like, they're like, is my camera working? I'm like, your camera's fine. And they're like, this is really kind of different. I haven't seen this before. And I'm like, cool. And it's kind of a nice introduction, but I also think it just looks good too. So, I mean, it's going to be weird when I'm back at work and everyone's like, oh, wow, you're in full color in 3D. So, but I'm looking forward to that quite a bit as well. But that's the story of it. That's why I ended up in black and white.
Right. It looks good too.
Yeah, it does. I agree.
I want to steal it, but I don't have a nice enough camera for that yet. So, thank you for that. Would you care to share?
Oh, you want me to say something about myself?
Yeah, about maybe your latest book or your current ventures.
Yeah. So I've been working in tech for 20, 30 years now, mostly on the leadership side. Done a lot of different companies. I I guess about 15 years or so ago, I was just writing a lot on my blog back when blogs were a thing. And I found that sort of there was this narrative and stories around leadership that the nice thing about blogging or putting things on the internet is you get feedback. And I was just putting random dumb stuff up there. And then I don't know, I talked about one-on-ones or something. And the feedback was just instant and like, and rich. And I was like, oh, I hit a nerve here. So people just kind of gave me feedback on what was working and what wasn't working in my writing. And it just led towards management and leadership. So that turned into Managing Humans, which its third edition is out there. And I just finished the fourth. I'm actually editing it right now. So that comes out later this year, a fourth edition of that, which is 60% blog and like 40% sort of other stuff in there. So it's fourth edition. It's like my proudest writing achievement that it's still doing well. The publisher's like, hey, we want to update this? And I'm like, yeah, but for like nerd books is a big deal because a lot of things are like, you know, very fashionable, like a technology or something, and you write it once and you move on to the next thing. This one I get to like edit and make better and better and better. So that comes out in a little bit. I did 2 other books as well. Being Geek, and then I just released one, it's all a blur now, last year called Art of Leadership with O'Reilly. So that's the most recent one. So there's a bunch of books out there, and I'm actually gonna, I haven't said this publicly yet, but I'll say it to you. I'm actually rebooting Being Geek because it's the weakest of the 3 books, and it's because it's sort of this career handbook for engineers. And that sounds like those words make sense, but what does that actually mean? And it's a very kind of complex concept. So I'm gonna pivot into being more of a sort of a path to leadership book, because a lot of the writing, shockingly, is about leadership, even though I kind of made it this career handbook. So I'm going to reboot it and turn it into something a little bit more sort of palatable for someone who's thinking about getting into leadership, which I think there's a lot of folks that have those questions. Anyway, that was more words than I was expecting.
Thank you for those words.
Sure.
And we are looking forward to the reboot.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So stories. Slack, it's a successful company. Mm-hmm. I would bet that most of our listenership or viewership knows it or even uses it on a day-to-day basis. And there are lots of kinds of different uses for it. And
totally.
People can even talk to themselves if they
I use it as reminders and to-dos. I have a channel for myself where I just put reminders in. So that's my reminder list is one of those. So yes, lots of uses.
So here is a good tip to begin with. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, you were at a different company before you joined Slack. If I remember correctly, you were at Pinterest.
That's right.
And I just wanted to ask how you ended up at Slack. What was kind of the story?
Yeah. Well, it goes back even a little further. Before I was at Pinterest, I was at a company called Palantir for like 4 years. And before that, I was at Apple for almost 8.5 years. And I'm back at Apple now, by the way. But we're not talking about that. It's all kind of tied together. At Palantir, I wasn't really doing product work. I was sort of doing culture work and growing the team and whatnot. And I went to Pinterest because I really wanted to get back into the hands-on sort of building of teams and building a product. And Pinterest was just, it is this sort of infinite catalog of ideas. It's always that place you go and you're like, hey, I wonder what kind of bookshelves would look good here. You go to Pinterest, you will see all the bookshelves, and it's just a great way to sort of explore and to dream. But I got a mail from Stuart Butterfield. A mail. I know someone on Twitter reached out to me and said, "Do you want to talk to Stuart about Slack?" I'm like, I am totally happy at Pinterest, but why not? I love Slack. I was using it then. I would like actively. I knew that I could see what the potential was, and I'm like, sure, I'll do that. And not at all thinking anything. With Stuart, smart dude. I'd love to chat with him. And he's like, hey, you want to come in? And I'm like, I'm really happy here, but I'd love to talk with you about Slack because I think Slack's amazing. So of course I went in, and as all recruiting stories go, suddenly I was like, oh shoot, I have a problem now. So Very long story short, sooner than I expected to leave Pinterest, I left to go be the first VP of engineering at Slack. So it was not the plan, but while Pinterest is an amazing and continues to be an amazing product, Slack, anyone who knows me knows that what Slack does and what Lopp does are kind of the same thing. It's like, how are we going to gather information? How are we going to make teams communicate effectively? How are we going to allow decisions to be better? All of these things are both leadership sort of goals, but also things that Slack can help with. And I love that. I love that. And this is pre-pandemic, by the way. Obviously, I was there, 3.5 years, all of them before the pandemic. Everyone learned a very powerful lesson about how hard it is to work remotely, because we all are doing it for the last 1.5 years. And Slack obviously I hope everyone agrees, is a perfect way to kind of, it doesn't replace the face-to-face communication at all, but it so easily augments or enhances communication in large teams or small teams of people. I really wanted to be a part of that, and I wanted to help grow it. So that was a long answer too.
I'm kind of going off script here, but it really sounds like my first lesson from this conversation is that you really have to be aligned with the kind of values of whatever company you're going into, so much so that you can identify with the product.
The values are harder to figure out. I agree with you. The values of a company are harder to figure out. To me, it was more the potential of the product. I was just so what it could do and what I want to do in terms of growing teams were so like, the first time I went in there, I went into Slack. They invited me to come in to speak as this Rands guy that I exist as in the internet on. And I just went in and did an hour Q&A with the engineering team. This is before anything had happened. It was just come in and chat. And I was giddy. And I do these things a lot. I'm like, come and talk. I'm like, sure, I'd love to talk to your team. This was like, I felt like a kid in candy store, because I was in there on this product that I actively was using and knew how well it could help. And it's not just Slack. It's IRC from years and years ago, and they obviously rebuilt it and totally made it better. But I knew how much potential was there, and I knew that the nerd crowd would get it. But here it was being made approachable for everyone, and I was just super excited to be there. So I'm like, hey, I have some feature ideas, everybody. This is in front of engineering. I have some feature ideas, everybody. Yeah, I'll talk to you about one-on-ones and culture and conflict management and all that sort of stuff. But can we talk about like emoji reactions? Because that's amazing. Let's talk about that.
That's awesome. Thank you. So to get back to the story, that means that you, how should I phrase this? You were the Lopp that we all know when you got there. So it wasn't like a real career advancement in the sense that like you changed positions and you came to the rise.
It was a lateral move.
So you came here as VP of Engineering and you left when you were VP of Engineering, so that you were in the position for the entirety of your time there. Did you have some kind of a goal, or if you could, of course, emoji reactions, but like, was there something that you could already kind of verbalize?
No, I mean, yes, but it's slightly different than what you're asking. Kind of like we said a couple minutes ago, it's like the thing that I am working on, I have to be deeply in my heart excited about. Otherwise I get bored. And I infamously like leave companies every 3 years. Like this is a known fact. You can go read my resume. That's what I do. Sorry, future employers. And it's just because I want to be excited about what I'm doing, and I want to solve whatever set of problems, and they're always different. I mean, there's things that are repeating or greatest hits and sort of problems and growing teams. But I wanted that. Number one was just be excited about the work. And for me, this was my third rapid growth startup, I knew quite a few of the things that they were going to go through. And I could really, really help there because I screwed it up so many times before that. But really, at the end of the day, it was like this product and how excited I was to be a part of that. So the goal was build something that is completely aligned with sort of your, as you said, values, and like take it to the next level and make sure that it can survive. What is some of the hardest work you do as a growing company is that sort of like 100 to 1,000 sort of growth curve.
Right. And so could you tell us a bit more about how the product looked like, or what it was like when you joined, and what it was like when you left?
Yeah, you sent me the question, so I've already thought about a lot of these. It was I probably, if I went back 4 years and saw it, I'd be like, whoa. But it was very similar product. I mean, the idea that the core ideas were all there. The things that changed while I was there was we were landing the enterprise product grid, so multiple workspaces, really going after that very large workspace. A lot of the pieces that changed were things on the back end, because we went from 5,000 users as sort of I don't know what the average was, but like, hundreds to thousands of users to thousands to hundreds of thousands of users, and active at the same time. So there was a huge amount of back-end infrastructure work to allow all of these very large companies that were seeing the value of Slack to be able to be there. Stuart, like at some point before I got there, long before, was like, we're mid-market, we want to be like 100 to 1,000, these small creative, like he said that, which that's what it was designed, but like it was customers like IBM that were getting on it, and that's a nation and suddenly inside of Slack. So a lot of what changed on the back end was you didn't see it on the front end, because it just worked. But that was where a lot of the change was going on, was scaling up that stack to be able to work with that many thousands of people.
And if we kind of steer towards the personnel changes and the leadership challenges that you had to face,
right?
How did the engineering team or teams change while you were there?
Yeah, it's kind of a boring story, but it was really sort of the development of that sort of they had some sort of director level, sort of manager of manager types, but it was really organizing around sort of a set of directors, the manager of manager types. There was a couple there, but they were kind of throwing the name out as like, oh, cool, yeah, you're making progress, so you're a director. And everyone's like, cool, what does that mean? They're like, we'll figure it out. So it was kind of defining those roles and then finding the people to fill those roles internally and externally, and building them and coaching them and getting them to kind of, own their different parts of the Slack stack and the Slack org. So that was the majority of my job, was recruiting and developing that leadership layer, and not just the managers, also other leaders, really focusing on individuals as well and their growth. So in terms of being leaders as well. So that was the biggest part, was really kind of, again, it was a similar story of Palantir, Pinterest, and Slack of, cool, we're 100 or so, and it's going to be 1,000 in 3 years. Walk us through how you're going to scale that without having it collapse on itself.
Right. And I was thinking about this today when I was excitedly preparing for talking to you, and what I was wondering is how you view your change. So you went there as an accomplished leader, as you said. You already knew what you were doing. You kind of had a feel for what had to be done. But this was also, it ended in 2019, so this was a few years ago now. And you also probably have changed ever since. And so I'm kind of wondering what kind of leadership takeaways you have about your growth while you were there.
Yeah, it's the biggest epiphany was that I don't think I really figured out how to be an executive until about a year into Slack. Now, if you go back and look at LinkedIn, you'll know that I was the VP of engineering at Pinterest 2 years before that. So that was really my first VP gig. The Palantir one, I was more of a director, and it's complicated. But so what I just told you is that I didn't know what I was doing until year 3 of the role. So the first, because I was at Pinterest for 2 years and then about a year in. We're really hard on ourselves as humans, because when we kind of get into a role or a promotion comes to us, and the role is significantly different, whether that's you're leveling up as an engineer or your first time manager or whatever. There's this term that I just came up with last week, which is you're aspirationally qualified, which means you believe you can do it and you're very excited to do it. And that's awesome, but you're not actually qualified for the role. Like, a new manager isn't qualified to be a manager when he or she starts. That's just the facts, because they've never done it before. So that's not bad. It's just realistic. So for me, and I think this is true for most kind of big changes to your job, it takes 3 years to actually figure it out. And no one likes to hear that, because they're like, cool, I'm a director now, or I'm a VP, I'm a tech lead, or whatever your title is. But you're starting there fresh. You have all of your experience, but if it's a different role with a different set of skills, it's going to take time to learn it, just like everything else. So my lesson, which I didn't realize in the moment, was really, I wasn't really comfortable as an executive and what that role was until about a year in at Slack. I was like, this kind of makes sense now. And I wish I knew this when I was at Pinterest, or I wish I knew this when I started at Slack. So that was the realization, was how long it takes to be competent at sort of these big, huge, complex roles. So, and as you said, it's continuing to evolve. My role at the current company is different. And it's a different company, it's a different culture, it's a different set of things. And I'm about a year and 4 months in, and I'm like, cool, I've got about 50% of it figured out, and in a year I'll be really someone that is, a problem to deal with.
So what I'm hearing is that, and this is also kind of like not specific to Slack, but
right.
What I'm hearing is that you have to be kind of contextually learning into the role itself, and then you also have to learn the context in which you operate, as in that there is a company around you and people and the culture and
cultures and rules they've had, social ones, spoken ones, unspoken ones, all that stuff that no one ever writes down. That's super important to kind of any leader, any human actually in the company has to sort of figure out over time. It's like, oh, why is it this way? It's like, we've always done it this way, but why? Like, why is this? Well, blah, 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 blah. And it's just a long story. And you're like, oh, cool. Interesting. I didn't know that.
Right. So while you were at Slack in this period of time, what were some of the, like, if you can tell us some stories, some of the most challenging times, or something that you can recall that was particularly interesting?
Yeah, the one that stuck with me was around the topic we already talked about, is sort of like this rapid growth of both the team, but also the infrastructure. When I got there, any engineer could push anything to production whenever they wanted. We were releasing Slack 100 times a day. Like, and that sounds delightful to me, because like, cool, like the story goes, like, customer support at Slack is run by this amazing human named Allie. And when I got there, they were really proud that customers would complain about XYZ, a legitimate problem or bug. Someone on Allie's team would talk to someone on my team, and they'd fix it, and they'd push the fix, and the customer support would be like, okay, go try it now. And they're like, oh, it works. What did I do? And they're like, we fixed the bug. Like, that sounds like a dream. But you can imagine the downside when it goes from, 60 talented engineers to 600. And so we had a lot of, we really, of course, engineers want that sort of sense of feeling empowered to do things, but we had a lot of work and to do in terms of sort of like staging areas and regression, pre-submission testing, and all these things that everyone should do, chaos, monkey testing, all blah, blah, long list of things that we needed to do. Unfortunately, we learned about it when things were getting a little shaky. I remember one particular day where we were down twice in the same day, like down, hard down, like, oh my gosh, down. And the thing I said, which I don't think is true, but it was intended to get everyone's attention. I'm like, hey, everybody, if Slack's down, the New York Times isn't going to publish. Like FYI, I doubt they were fine. I'm sure they were fine. But the point of the story was, this isn't a nice to have. We are business critical, and work is going to stop for a lot of people when we're down, and we needed to take that more seriously. And it was a little bit of sort of shoot from the hip, kind of releasing way too much. So we went from releasing like 100 times a day to a more sort of stage sort of rollout of like 3 to 6 times a day. And it sounds really easy when I say it like that, but like what I'm talking about here is really a 2-year process of like digging ourselves out of some pretty deep infrastructure, tech debt, and just tech debt in general that we had to go through. That was super hard. And it took a lot. It took us literally stopping one day. I said, okay, actually Cal is the CTO. This day that we were down twice. Cal, second time we were down, he's like sending me a text. He's like, hey, it was more strongly worded than I'm about to say. He says, we're not going to release anymore until we figure this out. I'm like, got it. And I gathered together everyone in my office, in a conference room. I said, cool, we're not going to release anything until we change this. So multi-hour at the whiteboard remediation, set together a plan that's going to take months, if not years, to get in place. But it took us getting into a pretty dire place to kind of change it on. And by the way, fixed, like you don't hear about, and I haven't been there in a year and a half, but like you don't hear about Slack being down anymore. It was years and years ago, and that was a lot of hard work and a lot of lessons, avoidable lessons that we have to go through.
Yeah, I was thinking that, as you mentioned, Slack was down twice a day, and I was thinking, has that ever happened? We use Slack.
It hasn't. They've so crushed it. They're doing such a good work over there.
Props to Slack. So I'm kind of wondering if you can kind of get into this a little more as to, as the VP of engineering, how much of your work is kind of being the visionary, working out the details versus figuring out the objectives of the day versus not really even touching the technicalities at all and just like being the leader for the entire engineering department.
Yeah, it starts with sort of understanding sort of the executive leadership in engineering. I worked for the CTO, Cal Henderson. He's one of the co-founders. And a question I get asked a lot that sort of starts to frame the answer to your questions is sort of like, what's the difference between a CTO and a VP of engineering? The way I view this is, in this scenario I was in, is Cal built the machine, like literally built the machine. And my job is to run the machine. So, and that when I say machine, I'm talking about not just Slack, the service, but all of the humans that work on it and kind of are productive and getting things done and are, following values and principles and that sort of thing. So my hopefully well-known sort of specialty is the people side of the equation. So it was kind of a dream scenario because Cal knew, because he's a co-founder and had written a lot of the code, really knew the tech stack in a way that was incredible. And it's certainly things I cared about and things I knew about, but my day-to-day was really focused on the 3 Ps, the process, the people, and the product. So that was my job, was to figure out how to grow that. So anyway, that's number one. how much did I focus on strategy versus tactics, I think is what your question is. It varied depending on where we were at in terms of sort of product cycle and whatnot. There was times where I was very tactical and just helping get a big feature across the line. And there was times where I'm just sort of working with all of my other VP types and kind of planning sort of the next 6 to 12 months and saying, these are the things we need to do, whether that was product stuff or people stuff or technology stuff or that sort of thing. So it varied. The other really important part of the job, which is the unexpected stuff. The lovely thing about, I say that ironically, the hard part of the role, one of the hard parts of the role is you're the human in charge of all of the things, which means that things that tend to get to you have already kind of passed through your people, their leaders, and they get to you. So most of the things that land on your plate are already 4-alarm fires, because if they could have handled it, they would have. And they're like, hey, Lopp, we need an issue. We need help on this. So there's probably a 25% of any day is dealing with the unexpected set of things around, thank you. Dealing with the unexpected set of things around, that just show up kind of randomly. So anyway, it could be anything. Like you just you get used to it. You're like, you can start to kind of smell it and go like, oh, this is a huge people disaster that they're handing me right now, and this is going to dominate my next 24 hours, right? That happens all of the time. So, and it's interesting though, because some of those things you look at and go like, why did this happen in the first place? Like whatever this situation is hypothetically, and it turns into strategy. It's like, oh, how did we get here? Oh my God, I have a huge issue in terms of leadership in this team because someone isn't doing their job because this thing caught on fire and got to me. So there's a lot of that too, where you're like, okay, cool. I now via a disaster and tactically getting through the disaster, that turns into strategy. I'm like, I got to solve this like further upstream. So that was a long answer to your question.
So in this case, you would go and discuss with the CTO, or would you?
It depends on we're talking abstractly. It could be, or talk with my team, or talk with Stuart, or talk with the head of product, or whoever I need to like go and sort of like brainstorm with if I need to kind of gather more signal there.
But so if, as you said, there are a lot of people who aspire to be some leadership position.
Why would they do that? It's a lot of work.
Exactly. And it's even work that is sometimes not viewed as work because you're not banging on keyboards.
Yeah.
Most of the time. So if someone is listening who is thinking about making this big move to a company that's, about to be the next big hit.
Right. Right.
They should be prepared for a lot of problem analysis and a lot of communications is what I'm hearing.
There's a lot of communication. There's a lot of sort of unexpected things showing up on your plate. There's a lot of, like you said, sort of triage, like what? I know what they're saying. I know what they're saying and how they're describing this, but what is really actually going on here? I had one of these literally this morning. It doesn't matter what it was, but someone saying, my person's cranky about this. And I'm like, And I'm like, is it, sorry, we're speaking abstract, but can't talk about specific things. But like I said, what about A, B, and C? They're like, yeah, A, but not B and not C. I'm like, so it's this. And it's this completely other thing than what we're talking about here. It's something about expectation setting, but this person and they're like, sorry, I'm abstracting things so it's not obvious what I'm talking about. But it was like, oh, this is the lesson this person needs to learn in some way, right? So I need to figure out how to teach that to them. So like that is all just part of the job right there. And like you said, I'm spending an hour or two thinking about this and figuring it through and not banging on any keyboards, but it's a real problem and it's a real thing that I have to go fix. And it's a real thing that I didn't think I had to fix this morning or earlier today. And it's fixing it isn't going to be, it's not like code. I can't like write some code or write a test. I actually have to teach this person something, and I have to make sure they heard it. And then I have to see them demonstrate it to me that they heard it in a way, right? Like this is, why would you want this job? It's super hard. I love it though. It's fun.
And that is what my next question is geared towards. It sounds like you've done this a lot of times, right? You also have been in the industry for quite a while. And in my head, there is this preconception that young and up-and-coming companies are looking for young and up-and-coming people who are full of energy and want to take on the world and all these things. And yet you somehow keep your energy up and kind of seem to have this kind of determination together with this enthusiasm and effectiveness. How do you keep it, or how do you do it?
It goes back to something we talked about earlier. It's like, the idea of languishing in a job, like literally saying that to you makes me angry. Like that someone would sit in a job and it's like, and by the way, I like working. Hopefully that's really clear. Like I really do like working quite a bit. And there's other folks that have different lives. They really like seeing the world. I like seeing the world too, but I really like working. Like I like that sense of productivity, right? And when I say languishing the job, I get super angry in my head because I think, why would if I'm in that, I'm going to change something immediately, perhaps irrationally. If I'm like, oh, I'm kind of stuck in a rut here. Like my wife knows this. She knows exactly when I get this realization that I'm sort of, and it happens about 2.5 years into a job, by the way. She hears this thing. I'm like, I say something. I go, yeah, I'm kind of bored. And she just goes gray because she knows I'm about to go and change everything. She's going to be like, he's going to like quit his job. He's going to go somewhere else it's going to be I've never heard of. And, you know, it's kind of, you know, she's taking care of the whole household and I'm just kind of running around, bumping into walls, changing stuff. So the reason I'm fired up is because I only work on things that are engaging me and that I love to do, which is a super privileged thing, by the way, the fact that I can have that much opportunity. But the moment that it becomes rote or it becomes familiar or whatnot, I'm like, cool, I'm done. Let's go work on something else, you know? And it's, you're laughing. There's downside to this. Like I tend to really sort of engage with things that are the bright and the shiny. And I'm really good at kicking off the product or the vision and everything. I'm the person you want if we're going to say, hey, let's go charge the hill. Climbing the hill, not my best skill set because it's kind of boring. It's actually the hardest part of the thing. Getting to that final, like that last 10% of getting to the summit, super hard. I love that part too, because it's like we're just scrapping together and trying to figure out how we're going to get it all done. So I tend to be really good at the beginning and the end of like the product cycle. But to answer your question, I always not reinventing myself. Fascinating, compelling challenges in front of me because the idea of language in a job is abhorrent to me. And that's my thing. I'm not saying that's for everybody. That's just the thing that I do. It's got to be something new and something interesting and something to learn or some incredible challenge or some competition that I can go win. I'm always looking for those opportunities. That was a good answer.
Yeah, it was. So kind of jumping off of that and also very relevant to that. One, also it's a preconception of mine. Another challenge for up and coming companies that are growing fast is keeping the people, the most important people.
Yep.
And it seems like you kind of know one part of why people would quit a company that's seemingly doing really well. What are some of your strategies to keep the people around who you like working with?
Sure. Yeah, it's the blog post that I wrote around this that did really well. Really simply answers your question, and it's easy to say and hard to do, which is most of my most of my little tweets. It's bored people quit. A different version of what I just told you, which is sort of like these folks that I want to continue to work with, the moment that they look or smell or even hint of boredom, I change what they're doing and I put something new, interesting, and big on their plate. And by the way, the goal, winning, is detecting their boredom before they're bored, which is super hard. But like if I'm in a one-on-one with Craig, my senior lead for, Team X, and he says anything that gives me a hint, and I'm working with 2 years, he's amazing, he's cranking, he's getting all the things done. And he says, yeah, when this is done, I'm not sure, blah, 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 blah. And all I heard was, I'm bored. I'm like, okay, cool. And in my head, I'm like, okay, clock is ticking. I'm 3 to 6 months away from him quitting in my head. So what am I going to do? I'm going to get him on a different team. I'm going to move my one-on-ones from fortnightly to weekly, and we're going to start debating architectural strategy or product strategy. And I'm going to get the moment that he says, God, I'd really love to prototype the blah. I'm like, cool, let's prototype that. 14 things I have on my plate. I'm like, I'll find someone else to do them. I simplify when I tell these stories because those 14 things have to get done and I have to figure out how to do it. But I'm going to clear the way for this person to go and get to their next thing, because the moment, just like me, by the way, the moment that they're engaged and kind of cool, this is my new problem that I'm working on here, they're not thinking about boredom. They're not thinking, all they're thinking about is, how am I learning right now? And isn't this cool? And like, what's the challenge here? Like, that's the state you want everybody to be in. It's hard because there's always like awful crap climbing the hill work you have to do. We all have to do. But that's what I do is keep those folks, keep a problem, an opportunity, whatever. Like there's a whole other strategy around, well, I really want to see what it's like. I want to be a manager, right? I'm an architect now. I want to be a manager. I'm like, that's a horrible idea. I don't say that anymore, but I say, cool. What we're going to do is I tried this at Slack to some success. We're going to create a tech lead manager. So I'm going to give you 3 people. They work for you full time. You can be a manager, and here's the rules, and here's some training, but you're still coding 50% of the time. So you can try before you buy. And if you love it, if it's great, and you start to scale yourself and your team, we'll make you a full-time manager. If it's not great, if you're sort of doing 60% coding and then 65% coding, then we'll go the other direction. And when that happens and everyone's like, oh, Craig's not a great manager, because it's not the story. The story is, we tried it. You didn't like it for these reasons. That's fine. Great. Let's get the other interesting thing on your plate in terms of being a great architect or a more senior engineering leader without being a manager. So that's the thing I do. I make sure that you have a fascinating problem in front of you that fires you up.
So if we are at a product company like Slack and you're the VP of engineering, and I am thinking the CTO would be the one who is your direct senior.
Yep. In that case, yeah.
And I am having a one-on-one with you, and I hear the hints of you getting bored of us kind of leveling into climbing the hill. What is one thing I can do to help you stay?
Help me, Michael Lopp?
Well, yeah, help you stay with Slack. I am in the point of view that it's really great for you to be at Slack. It's great for Slack, and we are just really having a great time here. And I don't want you to leave.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think to truly answer that question, you'd have to ask someone who was my manager over the last 20 years. And those are CEOs and CTO types. Because I actually don't know the answer. Because I'm not them and how they view me, right? So I can reflect on it, but I think my answer is very biased towards me because I'm me. Right. I take it very seriously, my professional growth for reasons we've talked about many times in the last 48 minutes. I feel like it's my job to manage that. And that's not, I have managers, they've been great, you know, they've done stuff, but like, I'm the one who actually knows what I need. And again, as I've said a couple of times, the moment that I'm like unhappy with a small or a large thing, like the ferocity that I go after my unhappiness is is impressive. Because I don't, life is short. I only get to do this once, and I want every minute to be important and relevant and valuable and productive. And, you know, even in my downtime, I'm looking for the next best video game so I can have fun with these moments that I have that are, you know, I really take my every moment seriously. Fear of death, probably. I don't know what it is, but like, it's up to me relative to my profession to see why I'm bored and to address it. And I think I'm probably bad at asking for help. Like, I probably will suffer more to solve a thing before I, you know, and talk to my boss and say, hey, you know, this is hard and I don't find it that interesting. So you're getting 50% of me. So please help. So I should be better at that. But I also think I want to be an example to other people that they have most of the ability to change their professional career, and they're either asking for help or choosing a different thing, or, you know, changing what they're doing, how they're working in a small scale. Like, I want individuals to feel empowered. I waiting for someone to tell me what to do also makes me super mad. Just ask my wife. She's like, you can't tell him what to do. You can ask him what he thinks about a thing, and if he chooses to do it, that's great. It's called being tell assertive versus ask assertive. I'm very ask assertive, and if you tell me to do something, I'm like, Arr! So I clearly need a lot of therapy.
Don't we all? So with just kind of steering back to the Slack story, you mentioned this lady, Amy, who was head of customer service, and how Allie, almost.
Yeah, you got it.
And she was really in line with development and making it kind of very effective within the size to help customers.
Yep.
How did you kind of move from that to the bigger engineering team and the longer release times and being not so reactive to customer feedback?
Yeah, it did start with sort of this inflection point of like, we really have a problem here. And what we did in that sort of war room that we called, we were like, we're not releasing. This is, again, we're releasing 100 times a day. We stopped it, I think, for like 2 weeks, except for like critical, like roll the logs or other sort of operational things we had to do. But I'd say there's probably 3 phases, and we don't have time to go through all 3, but phase 1 was just, where are we bleeding? Like, where is the obvious on fire bleeding parts of how we're building software right now that are urgent and important, and we can fix pretty quickly. So some examples in there were like, okay, cool. Like a staging area where we could, you know, test before we release to production, right? More of a release train methodology, sort of like, okay, cool. Everyone, the release train is at 2:00. Everyone who wants to get in the 2:00 one, check in by blah. And then that's the 2:00 release. And then if you don't get that, there's another one at 4, right? So that was both short-term things as well as sort of longer term, like tooling things. You have to build sort of a release train methodology and the tools to do sort of that. But it was really sort of identifying the short-term wins as well as the medium-term wins, and then the long-term things. It's going to be really hard. We have to land it. So, and number 2 was getting out of sort of the firefight, like of everyone just being terrified, because we terrified everybody. when we said we stopped everything, and more like stop breaking the build, right? So we had to also sort of everyone set everyone's expectations about what their responsibility was in terms of like, hey, you're doing a check-in, here's your checklist, and these are the things you need to do. And as I start saying these things, the folks that are, at their startups right now with 10 folks and are releasing at will, they're like, process is the worst. Right. And like, I really in my heart get that. But the way that I twist that around when someone gets cranky with me about like bureaucracy and whatnot is two things. I tell them, number one, process is documented culture. It's the means by which we learned a thing that we said, we captured it and said, we do this way because, right? So picking on an example from something what I said, when someone's like, hey, why do we only release 4 times a day at Slack on these release trains? I'm like, well, let me tell you. Like we were releasing 100 times a day and we were growing at blah, blah, blah rate. And we were crashing Slack twice a day. That seems suboptimal, right? And they're like, absolutely. And I told them a story and I justified why this process existed. The process didn't exist because some program manager was like, we should do it this way. The process exists to solve a real problem and that we were seeing. And we solved it too, which is why 2 years later, I'm telling the release train story to Ted. But there's a very important thing in there about process, which is it always needs to be able to defend itself. It needs to be able to explain itself. When someone comes to me, and not now, in prior life, and says, hey, I have this problem with this process. I'm like, I'm not familiar with it. Who owns it? Frank. Cool. Go ask Frank about why this exists. And if you don't like the answer, you don't have to if you can't defend it to you effectively, you don't have to do it. This has gotten me in a lot of trouble because Frank doesn't like it, didn't hear the person, and then just goes around them anyway. But the point is you have to be able to explain these things, this process stuff. It's because it becomes sort of like, structural culture things in a company. And we've always done it this way, but it's there for a reason. It came to address something that happened long ago. And if no one can tell you why we're doing this anymore, it's time to tear it down and to do something different. If it's impeding some creativity or something else, right? It needs to constantly reinventing itself. So I got into my process talk. So thanks for listening to my TED process talk.
So now that you have done it a few times, if you were to go to another company developing a product and being on the verge of becoming the next Slack, would you implement some processes because you know that there will be issues? Or would you wait for the issues to arise?
It's a really, really good question. Unfortunately, it's an depends question, because what I have learned is that every group of people sort of works in different ways. Here, let's simplify it even further. If I took 10 great engineers that are working on a Slack-like thing, and actually they're working on the same 10 engineers working on 2 different products at 2 different companies. That's not right either. How do I want to explain this? Every group of people is different. This 10 people building Slack versus 10 other people building exactly the same product are going to build a different product. They're going to do it in a different way, and they're going to end up with a different set of rules when they're done. Facts, right? Total facts. So if I was plopped into that 10-person thing and I knew exactly who the people were, I would still sit back and I size them up. I'd still sit back and see and look around and try to figure out, okay, cool. What versions of the problems does these 10 have, and work there. There's probably a couple things, though, just to contradict myself a little bit, that I would probably do right out of the gate. For example, a career path. I would actually take a very early swag and saying, hey, by the way, we're going to have 3 types of engineers, A, B, and C. And these are the rough attributes that I'm looking for here. I've spent so much time at a 1,000-person corporate company where we haven't done that. And we've had to sort of retrofit sort of an objective growth criteria to 1,000 folks. And that's a nightmare. So there's things like that I would I wouldn't try to boil the ocean, but I would probably land a couple of artifacts and say, hey, so I'm thinking about career growth, or here's the product process, or here's sort of a rough framework of how we make decisions here. And again, super simple, like simpler than you'd think was necessary. But I'd be like, cool. So who owns product? All right, the product managers do. They are, or there's other companies where I'd say it's a triad. It's product, it's design, and it's engineering. And if they can't decide, the CEO is a tiebreaker. I'm making these up literally right now, but those sorts of things I'd probably scribe after I sniffed around a little bit and said, like, they're stuck on this, or they're moving slow on that. So
right. So it will
and then
go on.
Yeah. Well, and also preventative maintenance things, like the career path being done early. I bet they would giggle at me, 10 engineers. If I came in and said, hi, I'm the new VP of engineering and here's your career path, they'd be like, what? Like, we don't even have a company yet. Like, I'd be like, I mean, it's cool. I'm just going to put it up on the wiki, and, but like in a year, they're going to come back and say, hey, I'm ready to get to the next level. I'm like, cool, well, you're this, and here's your role. How are you doing all of this? And they're like, oh my God, this has already been here. We have a plan. This is amazing.
Right. Or they would come and say, I can't remember that thing that you were talking about a year ago.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. I just wanted to kind of paraphrase to make sure I understand correctly.
Yeah.
That you kind of come in and you talk and you listen most of all, and kind of scan the room. It's like one of the things that I learned from you. It's like you put it so concisely when you said you always have to kind of measure the people who you are surrounded
Absolutely.
by.
Yep.
So you are building a feel for the company, but then there are some structural things that work and are necessary for good work, and so those you kind of give them to play around with, maybe.
Yeah, I think it more of it like, it's sort of incepting them. Like here's another thing that I would, in this hypothetical 10-person organization that we are joining. What is their religion on management? They probably don't have any managers right now. Or there's one person, she's the VP of engineering and she's got 9 direct reports, right? So why do they hire me? But like, you probably hired me because I've had a pretty good track record of growing companies for the last decade. That's like done it 3 times in a row. All 3 of them IPO'd. Hope someone's counting. So I'm good at that. A part of that. So 10 people, managers. We're going to have managers here. Well, if you hired me, there's definitely going to be managers. But that sounds like a threat. But I'm going to define what the role of the manager is, and what he or she is responsible for, and what powers they have and what powers they don't have. This is super awesome. Like, I to have that early, and not to have a little template of like, cool, I'm interested in this thing that I'm gonna. And again, it's not this huge like Magna Carta like definition of what a manager is. It's just a simple sort of way to understand it. But what I've done in that hypothetical scenario that's super important, I said, we're going to have managers. They're going to have these abilities that they're, I believe it or not, how much consternation I've taken out of future iterations of that company is a lot, because they're not going to have that. So what do we do about managers? Hey, we should do holacracy. What do you think about that? Nope, none of that's going to happen. We're going to have managers, and it's going to solve a lot of problems. I'm not saying it's the way. It's just the way that I choose to do it. And by declaring that early, I've saved a huge amount of stress and conversation and debate. And that's probably one of the hardest parts of being a good leader is your success is the absence of drama. The nothing happening is you doing your job well. And like, how satisfying is that? Pretty not satisfying, because no one gives you a compliment when nothing blows up. Like, it's just kind of, everything's working. This is great. There's all these folks that get so much, credit for doing the diving save and all this sort of stuff, which is great. And these humans are valuable. why did we get there in the first place? Some leader screwed up 2 years ago when he or she said, by the way, we're just going to release Slack 100 times a day, YOLO. Like, that was a mistake, because that's not a critique of my good friend Kel Henderson, who I love dearly, because rapid growth, Slack is the fastest growing, or was, I don't know, enterprise software in history. So like, that's a roller coaster you're going to get on. But like, we screwed up 2 years ago before like we had this horrible situation. And in terms of not thinking ahead and not doing preventative maintenance to allow us to scale. And there's a million very good reasons that we were there, but still, like, we should be hard on ourselves as leaders when something blows up, because our job is to not let things blow up.
That's a nice way of defining what a leader is. So you touched on this a little bit, but I want to ask you how you kind of experience going public. It's kind of like a badge of honor to you, I think.
Yeah. I was thinking about this question when I was reading the pregame on this. It wasn't that big of a deal. Now, financially, obviously a big deal for Slack, the company, obviously. Slack, even though my prior three's IPO, the only one I was around for was at Slack, they did a pretty good job of sort of saying it's a sub team that's going to drive this whole process, of incredibly complex process of sort of getting the company in shape to do it. But they did a really good job of communicating how it was going and who was necessary, and kind of making it a very small set of folks. So did it affect our work? A little bit. It was a little bit of a distraction. But at the end of the day, we were aware that it was going on. Some people were sort of involved in, things that needed to happen. But and definitely a badge of honor, but it didn't vastly affect the work. It was an amazing day in New York when we went public, and you're just like, oh my God, what's going to happen here? That was an amazing experience, and sort of a great celebration to walk around Wall Street and see your company logo up on a flag there, and up on a big huge banner there, and all that. But it wasn't a huge distraction, and like there are people that were doing it would have a very different answer than what I'm giving you right now. They'd be like, this was my life for 9 months and it was hell. So, but for me, it didn't really affect my work.
Right. There's a question here about integrations, and I think that kind of is true of like every kind of new thing that you have implemented into the product. How did that come around?
It was already there when I landed. It was the platform team. So, and it just seemed like an obvious extension to Slack. Slack is obviously there, and pulling my people together into this sort of concept of a channel and getting things done. A lot of that is just us going back and forth and throwing dancing penguin emojis at each other. But the idea that like we were going to think of all of the things you could do there was absurd. So they decided long before I got there to kind of make it this extensible platform. So it was, I wasn't part of that initial decision. I was there to kind of grow the team and do all those sorts of things. But it was an obvious thing that, you're going to want to be able to or integrate with all of the different pieces of content out there, like Google Docs or Quip or this sort of thing, and have those be a lot lower friction. And just again, kind of, I don't know how they're describing it now, but like I have Slack be your dashboard for everything about your company, whether that was who you're talking with, or how you're organizing projects, or how you're getting access to data that's coming in all these different places. I wanted it to be this dashboard for everything in your business. So, and that's what the goal with the integrations, the platform was.
Right. And it turned out to be that you can do everything with it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mentioned a few names, but I am particularly interested in if there was anybody who helped your work a lot, or who you have really fond memories with.
Cal, who hired me, is one of my favorite people on the planet. He and I are, I wonder if he would say this. I think he would say this. I think we're good friends. We are totally different people. Like we are, you could not pick more different people. And I can explain that, but we're just totally different. But I think that we also are like, we know that because of our differences that we were a good pair. Because he was, I won't characterize him, but we were different people. So that's one person that really I learned a lot from, and continue to learn from. But the other people are all my direct reports, my leadership team. I had just a phenomenal set of men and women who were running Slack. Many of them are now left Slack and are VPs elsewhere. And every time that one of my former directors ends up in a VP role, I go like, "That's right." I'm very sorry for Slack for losing them, but I'm very happy that I had a little bit to do with all of these humans, being VPs at companies. I'm like, yep, that's right. I would hire them to be a VP in a second. Great, good job, Company X.
Yeah, you're welcome, world. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
And we are kind of out of time here, so I'm just trying to get the most of our conversation. Did you have any kind of really challenging like talking to you is almost like life happens and you take your work seriously,
right,
and you fix things, and then you kind of smooth out the possible drama before it arises if you're doing your job well. But
sounds like a good story.
I'm sure I am sure you have had to go through really difficult situations.
Yeah.
If you care to share one, perhaps from Slack.
Yeah. Let's see. So many. Well, we talked about one, which is sort of like we have crumbling infrastructure. We don't need to go over that one as well. I think, I don't know if it's an experiment, but it was more of a failure on my part as a senior leader. We had a bunch of data come in about hiring. It was, so it's this big spreadsheet. How many people you've hired? Are they diverse or not? I don't know. All very important. This is many years ago. This is before the current situation that we're in right now. And the failure was, the way that I work, if you ask me a question, I'm going to give you an answer. And if you say, "Hey, Lopp, what are we doing? How are we doing on hiring, women in engineering?" I'm like, "I'm going to tell you that answer right now, and here's the data." That's just the way I work. Like, your next question is, what's one thing you'd like to suggest to executives in growing companies? And the answer is, tell the truth as quickly as possible. It's really good advice, by the way. But let me tell you how it backfires. So we had all this data in a spreadsheet, and I think my admin was like, "Hey, someone was asking for this spreadsheet. How are we going to share this information?" I'm like, "Just send it to them." Literally, like running between meetings on my phone. I'm like, "Just send them the spreadsheet." This was a horrible, awful, bad idea. Why? It was just a spreadsheet of numbers with like numbers and like column headers that said, is a hire, start date, whatever it was. Like it wasn't personnel. It was not personal information. Obviously, I wouldn't have shared that. It was but it was aggregate information. And there needed to be someone to look through that information and to frame it and to say, this is what we can learn from this. And it was by itself, any person could take this and find the worst possible story. And I learned this about an hour later when someone said, "Oh, by the way, we're not doing this at all." And I'm like, "What?" And they're like, "What's what the spreadsheet says?" I'm like, "That's not what it says. You're reading that one row, and like there's 27 rows, and you're like," but it was the phrase that came out of that failure that I've used since then is, "Don't YOLO the comms." Which means there's this, you have an added burden as a more senior leader about how you communicate and what you're saying and how you're saying it, and does it make sense? And yes, I really want executives to tell the truth quickly as possible, but I also know that they really need to be thoughtful about the things they're saying, and it needs to stand up to scrutiny, and it needs to be explained, especially complex concepts around diversity or hiring or culture, or pick your thing. You have to think it through, and that perhaps violates my advice to executives of do it fast, because I want to do it fast. I want to get you that answer as quickly as possible. But there's sometimes I'm just going to say, that's a great question. I need to go gather the data and find the correct story for you. And to tell you that completely, it's going to take me some time. So I say that, and I wish I could tell you what it was right now, but I need to be able to tell this story. I need to explain this strategy. I need to say why we failed on this thing in a very clear way so that it makes sense and it doesn't create confusion. Because what I did is I created confusion. It's all was data there. And once we got everyone together and we said, hey, these are the things you can learn from this spreadsheet. These are the highs, these are the lows, this is how it fits together. I was like, oh, cool. This isn't a disaster. I'm like, I know. I didn't give you the framing. So that was one. And it was awful. It was awful because I YOLO'd the comms.
So do it fast and do it sensibly, I think.
Yeah. And tell the truth as quickly as possible.
Thank you for sharing that story. I hope that someone can learn from it and not make a mistake. Thank you.
Yeah, but if you don't make mistakes, then how do you learn things? That's the other thing. I make mistakes all the time. So but I learn as quickly as possible too.
So don't be afraid of mistakes either.
Yep.
It's hard to be a leader.
It really sucks. Yes. Why would you want this job?
So we have reached the end of our time and pretty much the end of our questions. Is there anything else that you would like to share with the world?
I'm really looking forward to seeing you all in person at some point. It seems like, we're here in the US, we're after being horrible for so long, it seems like we're headed in the right direction. But I'm looking forward to these sorts of things happening at conferences, face to face around the world, and getting out and actually being humans face to face again. So looking forward to seeing you all as soon as possible.
That's awesome. I hope so too. Hopefully we'll make it happen. And where can we follow you?
On Twitter, I'm all pithy and snarky. Rands, Twitter is Rands, @Rands. And my blog is randsandrepose.com. That's where you can read all the stuff. There's about 1,000 articles up there.
Thank you so much. Everybody who isn't following Rands yet, you should, to learn a lot. Thank you for joining us today again, and thank you for these stories. I think we can all take a lot away from today's episode of the Level Up Engineering podcast. To our listeners, thanks for staying with us. I am Karolina Tóth, and I hope to see you next time.
Thanks for staying with Level Up Engineering. If you enjoyed this podcast, so will your friends. Share this episode on your favorite social networking platform. To stay up to date with our content, follow Level Up Engineering on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or Google Podcast. Brought to you by Coding Sans, a software development agency building web applications with Angular and Node.js. Check them out at codingsans.com.